in charge here? Answer me!
We are. This is our wedding reception.
I don't.
Show me proof you're supposed to be here.
Officer, this is our venue. We paid for it.
Don't lie to me. People like you don't belong in a place like this.
Officer, identify your legal basis immediately.
Everyone.
The camera was still rolling when the screaming started. What was supposed to be the most beautiful day of Jasmine and Derek's lives turned into a nightmare that would expose decades of hidden racism and cost one police officer everything he had worked for. The wedding reception at Magnolia Gardens was in full swing when Officer Robert Hayes arrived, called by someone who claimed there was a disturbance. But there was no disturbance. There were just two successful black professionals celebrating their marriage with family and friends at one of the most exclusive venues in the county. What happened next would be captured on multiple phones, shared millions of times, and ultimately result in a settlement that shocked the entire state. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button because you definitely won't want to miss how this unfolds. The couple at the center of this storm had done everything right. Jasmine worked as a pediatric surgeon at the Regional Medical Center. Derek was a successful architect who had designed several prominent buildings downtown. They had saved for 3 years to afford their dream wedding at Magnolia Gardens, a historic plantation turned luxury event venue that charged premium prices for its pristine gardens and elegant ballroom. The guest list included doctors, lawyers, business owners, teachers, and community leaders. This wasn't some wild party or rowdy celebration. It was an upscale affair with a jazz quartet, professionally catered dinner, and carefully planned timeline that had been coordinated with the venue for months. Everything had been going perfectly until Officer Hayes walked through those doors at 8:37 that evening. The wedding had started at 4 in the afternoon. The ceremony was flawless. Jasmine looked stunning in her custom gown. Derek was handsome in his tailored tuxedo, and their families had traveled from across the country to witness their union. The reception began at 6 with cocktails on the terrace, followed by dinner in the main ballroom. Guests were laughing, dancing, and celebrating exactly as they should at a wedding reception. The venue coordinator, a young woman named Sarah, had been working weddings for 5 years and later testified that this was one of the most well-behaved groups she had ever hosted. No one was intoxicated. No one was being loud or disruptive. The music was at an appropriate volume. The guests were dressed elegantly and conducting themselves with class and dignity. There was absolutely nothing that would warrant calling law enforcement, but someone did call. And that someone remained anonymous, though their motivation would become crystal clear as the evening unfolded. The call came into the police department at 8:15, reporting a disturbance at Magnolia Gardens. The caller claimed there was loud music, unruly behavior, and concerns about property damage. Every word was a lie, but it was enough to dispatch Officer Hayes to investigate. Hayes had been with the department for 12 years. He drove a patrol car through wealthy neighborhoods, responded to noise complaints, and handled minor disturbances. He was known among his colleagues as someone who took his authority seriously, perhaps too seriously. What wasn't known until much later was that Hayes had received 6 previous complaints about his treatment of black citizens. 6 complaints that had been filed away and forgotten by a department more interested in protecting its own than protecting the community it served. When Hayes arrived at Magnolia Gardens, he didn't walk into a scene of chaos or disruption. He walked into exactly what anyone would expect at an elegant wedding reception. Well-dressed guests mingling on the terrace, soft jazz music playing in the background, and the bride and groom sharing a quiet moment near the garden fountain. A reasonable officer would have taken one look around, realized the call was bogus, and left. But Hayes wasn't reasonable. Instead of speaking to the venue coordinator or asking to see the event contract, Hayes walked directly toward the bride and groom. Jasmine and Derek were standing with Derek's elderly grandmother, showing her the wedding photos on Jasmine's phone. They were having a private family moment, smiling and laughing as grandmother admired the pictures of her grandson's special day. Hayes approached them with his hand already resting on his belt, near his handcuffs. He didn't introduce himself politely or explain why he was there. Instead, he demanded to know who was in charge of this event. Derek, confused but cooperative, explained that he and Jasmine were the bride and groom, and this was their wedding reception. Hayes looked at them skeptically, as if he couldn't believe these two successful black professionals could afford such an upscale venue. What happened next was captured by at least 7 different phones. Derek's cousin Michael had been filming candid moments throughout the reception and was still recording when Hayes arrived. Several guests noticed the officer's aggressive demeanor and started recording on their own phones. The bride's sister started a live stream on social media that would later be viewed by millions. Every ugly second was documented from multiple angles. Hayes told Derek that he needed to see proof they had permission to be there. Derek, maintaining his composure despite the obvious absurdity of the request, offered to get the venue coordinator to confirm their booking. Hayes said that wasn't necessary and demanded to see their identification instead. Jasmine asked why they needed to show identification at their own wedding reception. Hayes said he was investigating reports of trespassing and disorderly conduct. The conversation was already attracting attention from other guests. Derek's father, a retired federal judge, walked over to see what was happening. Jasmine's mother, a prominent businesswoman, joined them. Both parents had decades of experience dealing with difficult situations and tried to de-escalate by politely explaining that this was their children's wedding and offering to provide any documentation Hayes needed. Hayes became increasingly aggressive. He raised his voice and told them all to step back. He said he had received reports of illegal activity and everyone needed to cooperate with his investigation. The elderly grandmother, who had been quietly watching this unfold, asked what illegal activity he was talking about. Hayes couldn't answer because there wasn't any illegal activity. There was just a black family celebrating a wedding, and apparently someone found that threatening enough to call the police. The venue coordinator finally appeared, drawn by the commotion. Sarah rushed over and tried to explain to Hayes that this was a legitimate wedding reception, that the couple had booked the venue months in advance, and that there had been no problems whatsoever. Hayes barely listened to her. He was focused entirely on the family, treating them like criminals despite having no evidence of any wrongdoing. That's when Derek made a decision that would prove crucial later. He pulled out his phone and started recording the interaction himself. The moment that camera came up, Hayes became even more hostile. He ordered Derek to put the phone away. Derek calmly stated that he had the right to record a police officer in a public space. Hayes stepped closer, invading Derek's personal space in an obvious attempt at intimidation. Jasmine, still in her wedding dress, tried to defuse the situation by asking Hayes what exactly he needed from them to resolve this misunderstanding. Hayes told her there was no misunderstanding and that he had authority to remove anyone from the premises if he deemed it necessary. The threat was clear, and it sent shockwaves through the wedding guests who had gathered to watch this surreal confrontation. Derek's cousin Michael, who was still filming, captured Hayes making his most damaging statement. When Jasmine asked again what they had done wrong, Hayes replied that people like them didn't belong in a place like this and that he knew they couldn't afford it legitimately. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Here was a police officer, in uniform, suggesting that successful black professionals couldn't possibly afford an upscale wedding venue without criminal activity. The reaction from the wedding guests was immediate and powerful. These weren't people who could be easily intimidated or dismissed. The guest list included some of the most prominent citizens in the state. Derek's law school roommate was now a sitting judge. Jasmine's medical school friend was the chief of surgery at the university hospital. The best man was a successful entrepreneur who owned multiple businesses. These were people with influence, connections, and the resources to fight back. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, Jasmine's mentor and the head of pediatric surgery, stepped forward and identified herself to Hayes. She explained that she had known Jasmine for years, that this was absolutely a legitimate wedding reception, and that his behavior was completely inappropriate. Hayes told her to mind her own business and step back. Dr. Kane, who had never been spoken to so rudely in her professional life, was shocked but stood her ground. Judge William Foster, Derek's father, decided it was time to assert some authority of his own. He approached Hayes and calmly identified himself as a retired federal judge. He explained that his son and daughter-in-law had every right to be there. that no laws were being broken, and that Hayes needed to either articulate specific charges or leave the premises. Instead of backing down when faced with a former federal judge, Hayes became even more belligerent. Have you ever witnessed something like this happen at what should have been a happy celebration? Let me know in the comments what you think should happen next. Hayes told Judge Foster that he didn't care what title he used to have, that he was the authority here, and that everyone needed to comply with his orders or face arrest. The threat to arrest wedding guests for the crime of attending a wedding was so outrageous that several people started calling their own lawyers right there on the spot. The situation escalated when Hayes grabbed Derek's arm and told him he was being detained for questioning. Derek had done absolutely nothing wrong. He was standing at his own wedding reception, had provided identification when requested, and had been completely cooperative throughout this bizarre encounter. But Hayes seemed determined to assert his dominance and show everyone who was in charge. That's when the guests intervened in a way that would change everything. Instead of dispersing or backing away, they formed a protective circle around the bride and groom. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, and community leaders linked arms and stood together, refusing to allow this officer to destroy what should have been the happiest day of Derek and Jasmine's lives. The image was powerful and would later become iconic. A bride in her white wedding dress and groom in his black tuxedo, surrounded by their friends and family, facing down a lone police officer who had no legitimate reason to be there. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, love, celebration, and community. On the other, hatred, prejudice, and abuse of power. Dr. Kane stepped forward again, this time pulling out her own phone to call the hospital's legal department. She spoke loudly enough for Hayes to hear, explaining that a police officer was harassing wedding guests and threatening arrests without cause. Hayes told her to hang up the phone. She refused. He reached for her arm, and that's when Judge Foster intervened with the full weight of his decades on the federal bench. The retired judge positioned himself between Hayes and Dr. Kane, speaking in the measured tone he had used in countless courtrooms. He informed Hayes that he was now witnessing potential violations of civil rights, assault, and harassment. He advised Hayes that continuing this course of action would result in federal charges and personal liability. Hayes seemed to realize for the first time that he might be in over his head, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. The venue coordinator, Sarah, was frantically trying to reach her manager, explaining into her phone that a police officer was disrupting a wedding reception for no apparent reason. The manager, David Chen, arrived within minutes and was appalled by what he found. Magnolia Gardens had hosted thousands of events over the years, and never had law enforcement attempted to shut down a legitimate celebration. Chen approached Hayes and politely but firmly explained that this was a private event, that the couple had paid in full, and that there had been no complaints from neighbors or other guests. He showed Hayes the signed contract, the insurance certificates, and the permits required for the event. Everything was completely legal and properly documented. Hayes barely glanced at the paperwork before dismissing it as irrelevant. The live stream that Jasmine's sister had started was gaining viewers by the minute. Comments were pouring in from people expressing outrage and disbelief. Local news stations monitoring social media began dispatching crews to the venue. What Hayes didn't realize was that his actions were being broadcast in real time to thousands of people, many of whom were already contacting local officials and demanding answers. Derek's best man, a successful business owner named James, had been recording everything on his phone while simultaneously texting updates to his network of contacts. Within minutes, he had reached out to the mayor's office, the police chief, and several prominent civil rights attorneys. The response was swift and decisive. The mayor's chief of staff called the venue directly, speaking to Chen and demanding an immediate explanation for why police were disrupting a private wedding reception. Meanwhile, Jasmine stood in the middle of this chaos, still wearing her beautiful wedding dress, watching her dream day turn into a nightmare. She had worked her entire life to reach this point. Medical school, residency, building her practice, saving money for this perfect wedding. And now a single racist police officer was trying to destroy it all because he couldn't accept that black people belonged in upscale spaces. Derek squeezed his wife's hand and whispered that they would get through this together. The guests around them continued to stand firm, creating an unbreakable wall of solidarity. These were people who understood power, who knew their rights, and who refused to be intimidated. Hayes had picked the wrong wedding to target with his prejudice. The first news crew arrived just as Hayes was threatening to call for backup. The reporter, a veteran journalist named Lisa Rodriguez, quickly assessed the situation and began interviewing guests about what they had witnessed. The stories were consistent and damning. A police officer had arrived at a peaceful wedding reception and immediately began harassing the black bride and groom without justification. Hayes noticed the news cameras and his demeanor changed noticeably. He seemed to realize that this situation was spiraling beyond his control. The venue coordinator suggested he speak with his supervisor before taking any further action. Hayes reluctantly agreed to step aside and make the call, but he made it clear this wasn't over. While Hayes was on the phone with his supervisor, the wedding guests began sharing their footage on social media. The hashtag #WeddingWhileBlack started trending within hours. Videos showing Hayes making racist comments and threatening to arrest innocent wedding guests spread across every platform. Local news stations interrupted their regular programming to cover the developing story. Dr. Kane used this brief respite to check on Jasmine, who was understandably shaken by the ordeal. As a surgeon, Jasmine was accustomed to high-pressure situations, but this was different. This was personal, humiliating, and completely unjustified. Dr. Kane assured her that the medical community would stand behind her completely and that Hayes would face consequences for his actions. Judge Foster gathered the male wedding guests and quietly advised them on their legal rights. He explained that they had every right to be there, that Hayes had no legal justification for his actions, and that documenting everything was crucial for the inevitable legal proceedings. Several guests were already calling their attorneys, preparing for what promised to be a significant civil rights case. The supervisor's response came quickly. Hayes received a call ordering him to cease all enforcement action and return to the station immediately. His face turned red as he listened to what was clearly a harsh reprimand from his superior. The wedding guests watched as Hayes realized his career was likely over. But even then, his arrogance wouldn't allow him to simply apologize and leave quietly. Hayes approached Derek one final time, his voice low but clearly audible to the surrounding phones still recording. He told Derek that this wasn't finished, that he would be watching him, and that people like him needed to remember their place. The threat was unmistakable, and it sealed Hayes' fate. Threatening citizens while in uniform was a firing offense, and he had just done it in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras. James stepped forward and informed Hayes that his threat had been recorded and would be turned over to both Internal Affairs and the FBI Civil Rights Division. Hayes paled as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Threatening a federal judge's son at his wedding reception while being filmed was possibly the worst decision of his entire life. The police supervisor arrived just as Hayes was preparing to leave. Captain Rodriguez had been with the department for 25 years and had never seen anything quite this egregious. She immediately began damage control, apologizing profusely to the wedding couple and assuring them that Hayes would face serious disciplinary action. But the damage was already done, and everyone knew it. Derek stood with his arm around Jasmine, both still in their wedding attire, as Captain Rodriguez tried to explain how this situation had occurred. The explanation was unsatisfactory because there was no legitimate explanation. Hayes had received a false complaint, arrived at a peaceful event, and decided to harass the black couple celebrating their wedding. It was textbook racial profiling, captured on video, with dozens of prominent witnesses. The news crews multiplied as word spread throughout the city. By 10 o'clock that evening, 4 different stations had reporters on scene. The story was already being picked up by national outlets. A racist police officer disrupting a black couple's wedding reception was exactly the kind of story that captured public attention and sparked outrage. Jasmine's sister continued her live stream, now with over 50,000 viewers watching in real time. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of the couple and furious about Hayes' behavior. Donations to various civil rights organizations poured in from viewers who wanted to support the fight against this kind of discrimination. The wedding guests began organizing their response. Judge Foster coordinated with several attorneys to ensure all evidence was properly preserved. Dr. Kane reached out to medical organizations to document the professional standing of the couple. James contacted business associations to demonstrate the couple's community ties and reputation. Sarah, the venue coordinator, was devastated that such a beautiful event had been tainted by Hayes' racism. She worked frantically to salvage what remained of the evening, ensuring the couple could at least have their first dance and cut their cake. The guests rallied around Derek and Jasmine, determined to end the night on a positive note despite everything that had happened. The cake cutting became an act of defiance. Surrounded by their loved ones, with news cameras rolling and social media watching, Derek and Jasmine fed each other wedding cake while Hayes drove away in his patrol car, his career effectively over. The image of the couple smiling despite everything they had endured became a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of hatred. As midnight approached, the wedding guests finally began to disperse, but not before exchanging contact information and promising to support Derek and Jasmine through whatever legal proceedings lay ahead. These weren't just wedding guests anymore. They were witnesses to injustice and allies in the fight for accountability. The hotel suite where Derek and Jasmine spent their wedding night was filled with flowers and cards from well-wishers who had seen the news coverage. Instead of celebrating their union in private, they found themselves planning a legal strategy and coordinating with attorneys who had reached out to offer their services pro bono. By morning, the story had exploded across social media and news outlets nationwide. The hashtag #WeddingWhileBlack was trending on every platform. Hayes' name and face were everywhere, along with his history of complaints and the department's failure to address his obvious bias. Public pressure for his termination and criminal charges mounted with each passing hour. Derek and Jasmine woke up as reluctant symbols of a larger fight against systemic racism and police misconduct. Their honeymoon would have to wait. They had a case to build, a community to organize, and a system to challenge, but they wouldn't do it alone. The powerful network of friends and family who had witnessed Hayes' behavior were ready to fight alongside them. The police department's internal investigation began within hours, but the damage control efforts were already failing spectacularly. Chief Patricia Miller held an emergency press conference at 7 in the morning, attempting to distance the department from Hayes' actions. She emphasized that his behavior did not reflect departmental values and promised a thorough investigation. The reporters weren't buying it, especially when they started asking about the 6 previous complaints that had somehow been ignored. Rebecca Chen, an investigative journalist with the local newspaper, had spent the night digging through public records. She discovered that Hayes had been the subject of multiple excessive force complaints, all involving black citizens, and all had been dismissed with minimal investigation. The pattern was undeniable, and it painted the entire department in an extremely unfavorable light. The mayor called an emergency meeting with city council members and the police chief. Mayor David Thompson had been in office for 8 years and prided himself on maintaining good community relations. This incident threatened to undo years of careful political work, especially with an election coming up in 6 months. He knew heads would have to roll, and they would have to roll quickly. Derek and Jasmine spent their first morning as a married couple meeting with attorneys instead of enjoying room service and planning their honeymoon. The civil rights law firm of Williams & Associates had reached out before dawn, offering to represent them pro bono in what they saw as a clear-cut case of constitutional violations and civil rights abuse. Attorney Sarah Williams had handled dozens of police misconduct cases over her 15-year career, but this one was particularly egregious. The video evidence was crystal clear, the witnesses were impeccable, and the officer's own words had sealed his fate. She explained to the couple that they had grounds for both criminal charges against Hayes and a substantial civil lawsuit against him personally and the police department. The medical community rallied around Jasmine with unprecedented speed and unity. The State Medical Association issued a statement condemning Hayes' actions and expressing full support for one of their most respected members. Hospital administrators where Jasmine worked called to assure her that she had their complete backing and that they would provide any resources needed for her legal fight. Derek's architectural firm issued their own statement, praising his professionalism and character while denouncing the obvious racial profiling he had endured. Several major clients reached out personally to express their support and anger over the incident. The business community was taking sides, and they were firmly behind the couple. The FBI Civil Rights Division opened an investigation within 48 hours of the incident. Federal prosecutors had watched the videos, reviewed the evidence, and determined that Hayes had likely violated multiple federal statutes designed to protect citizens from police abuse. The involvement of federal authorities elevated the case from a local police matter to a national civil rights issue. Hayes was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of both the internal investigation and the federal probe. His police union initially issued a statement supporting him, claiming he had been following standard procedures. That statement was quickly retracted after union leadership watched the videos and realized their member was completely indefensible. The wedding venue, Magnolia Gardens, faced its own crisis as the story spread. Several upcoming events were canceled by clients who didn't want to be associated with a location where such blatant racism had occurred. The venue's management team worked frantically to demonstrate that they had supported Derek and Jasmine throughout the ordeal and had no tolerance for discrimination. Social media campaigns emerged organically as people across the country learned about the incident. The hashtag Justice for Derek and Jasmine joined Wedding While Black in trending nationwide. Celebrities, politicians, and activists shared the videos and demanded accountability. The couple found themselves with supporters they had never met but who were deeply invested in seeing justice served. Local businesses began displaying signs supporting Derek and Jasmine, while others faced boycotts for remaining silent. The incident had divided the community along predictable lines, with some defending Hayes as a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake, while others saw his actions as part of a larger pattern of systemic racism that needed to be confronted. The internal affairs investigation moved at record speed under intense public scrutiny. Investigators interviewed every guest who had witnessed Hayes' behavior, reviewed all available video footage, and examined his complete personnel file. What they found was a pattern of misconduct that had been consistently overlooked by supervisors more interested in protecting the department's image than holding officers accountable. Hayes' partner that night, Officer Maria Gonzalez, was also placed under investigation for failing to intervene. She had remained in her patrol car during most of the incident, claiming later that she thought Hayes was handling a routine noise complaint. Her explanation fell apart when investigators pointed out that she could clearly see and hear what was actually happening and had done nothing to stop obvious misconduct. The district attorney faced enormous pressure to file criminal charges against Hayes. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, demanding that he be prosecuted for assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. The DA had successfully prosecuted police officers before, but never in such a high-profile case with such overwhelming evidence and public attention. Derek and Jasmine made the difficult decision to speak publicly about their experience. They held a press conference 1 week after their wedding, standing together in front of the courthouse where they hoped to see justice served. Jasmine spoke eloquently about the humiliation and fear she had felt while Hayes threatened to destroy the most important day of her life. Derek described the helplessness of watching his new wife being terrorized by someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. He talked about the privilege they had experienced in having powerful friends and family members who could intervene and document everything. He emphasized that countless other families face similar abuse without cameras, witnesses, or resources to fight back. The press conference was carried live on multiple networks and shared millions of times online. The couple's dignity and articulate description of their ordeal further galvanized public opinion against Hayes and the department that had enabled his behavior for over a decade. 3 weeks after the incident, the FBI announced that Hayes would face federal civil rights charges. The indictment alleged that he had willfully deprived Derek and Jasmine of their constitutional rights under color of law, a felony that carried potential prison time. The announcement was met with celebration from civil rights groups and anger from police unions, who saw it as federal overreach. The city council voted unanimously to settle the civil lawsuit before it even went to trial. They recognized that fighting the case would be expensive, embarrassing, and ultimately futile given the overwhelming evidence of Hayes' misconduct. The proposed settlement of $1.8 million was the largest police misconduct payout in the city's history. The settlement negotiations revealed just how strong the couple's case actually was. The city's attorneys admitted privately that Hayes' actions were indefensible and that the department's failure to address his previous complaints created massive liability. They warned city officials that refusing to settle could result in an even larger jury verdict and additional punitive damages. Derek and Jasmine struggled with whether to accept the settlement or proceed to trial. Part of them wanted their day in court, wanted to force the department to publicly acknowledge its failures and commit to meaningful reform. But their attorneys advised that the settlement would guarantee compensation while allowing them to move forward with their lives. The medical board launched its own investigation into whether the incident had affected Jasmine's ability to practice medicine. Patients and colleagues overwhelmingly supported her, but the board needed to ensure that the trauma and ongoing legal proceedings wouldn't compromise her surgical skills. The investigation was completed quickly and found no impact on her professional competence. Derek's architectural projects faced unexpected scrutiny, as some questioned whether the publicity would affect his business relationships. Instead, the opposite occurred. His client base expanded as people specifically sought out his services to show support. Several major development projects came his way from clients who admired his dignified handling of the situation. The police department implemented new training requirements and oversight procedures in response to the incident. Officers would now receive enhanced civil rights training, and complaints would be investigated by an independent civilian review board. The changes were seen as positive steps, though critics argued they should have been in place years earlier. Hayes attempted to resign from the department before formal disciplinary action could be taken, hoping to preserve his pension and avoid termination. The police chief refused to accept his resignation, insisting that he be officially fired for cause. The termination eliminated his pension benefits and ensured that his personnel file would reflect the reason for his dismissal. The criminal trial began 6 months after the wedding incident. Federal prosecutors presented a methodical case documenting Hayes' pattern of targeting black citizens and his clear violation of Derek and Jasmine's constitutional rights. The defense struggled to explain away video evidence that showed their client making explicitly racist statements and threats. Jury selection proved challenging as potential jurors had strong opinions about the case. The videos had been seen by millions of people, and finding impartial jurors required extensive questioning about their views on police misconduct and racial profiling. Eventually, a diverse jury was seated, including several professionals who understood the seriousness of civil rights violations. The trial testimony was devastating for Hayes. Guest after guest described his aggressive behavior and racist comments. The venue coordinator testified that there had been no legitimate reason to call police. Expert witnesses explained how Hayes' actions fit the textbook definition of racial profiling and constitutional violations. Hayes' own testimony was a disaster. He struggled to explain his actions and became increasingly defensive under cross-examination. When prosecutors played the video of him telling Derek that people like him didn't belong at the venue, Hayes had no credible explanation. His claim that he was just doing his job rang hollow when confronted with the obvious evidence of bias. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Hayes was convicted of violating the couple's civil rights, assault under color of law, and making threats against citizens. The quick verdict sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's badge. Derek and Jasmine attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row as witnesses testified about Hayes' misconduct. They wanted to look him in the eye as the justice system finally held him accountable for his actions. The guilty verdict brought them a sense of closure, though they knew the damage to their wedding day could never be fully repaired. The sentencing phase would determine how much time Hayes would spend in federal prison. Prosecutors argued for the maximum sentence, pointing to his abuse of authority and the lasting trauma inflicted on his victims. The defense pleaded for leniency, claiming Hayes had learned from his mistakes and posed no future threat to the community. Judge Margaret Foster, no relation to Derek's father, had handled numerous civil rights cases during her tenure on the federal bench. She had seen police officers abuse their authority before, but rarely with such clear evidence and obvious malicious intent. The videos showed Hayes deliberately humiliating a couple on their wedding day purely because of their race. The impact statements from Derek and Jasmine were powerful and emotional. Jasmine described how Hayes had stolen something precious from their wedding day that could never be recovered. Derek talked about the fear and helplessness he had felt watching his new wife being threatened by someone sworn to protect citizens. Judge Foster sentenced Hayes to 3 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the sentencing guidelines. She stated that his actions represented a profound betrayal of public trust and caused immeasurable harm to 2 innocent people on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Hayes was also ordered to pay restitution and banned from ever working in law enforcement again. The $1.8 million settlement was finalized shortly after Hayes' conviction. Derek and Jasmine used a portion of the money to establish a foundation supporting victims of police misconduct, particularly those who lacked the resources and connections they had been fortunate to possess. They wanted to ensure that other families facing similar injustices would have access to legal representation and support. The police department underwent significant restructuring following the incident. The chief was forced to retire early, and several supervisors who had ignored Hayes' previous complaints were demoted or transferred. New policies required immediate investigation of racial profiling complaints and mandatory reporting of officer misconduct by colleagues who witnessed it. Hayes served his full sentence without parole. His appeals were unsuccessful, and he was released to a community that wanted nothing to do with him. His pension was gone, his career was over, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. He had lost everything because he couldn't accept that black professionals belonged in upscale venues celebrating life's most precious moments. Derek and Jasmine eventually took their delayed honeymoon, but they never forgot the lesson from their wedding day. Their story became a powerful example of how standing up to injustice, documenting everything, and having the courage to fight back could create real change. They proved that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into something meaningful when people refused to accept discrimination as inevitable. The wedding guests who had formed that protective circle around the couple remained close friends and allies. They had witnessed something ugly that night, but they had also seen the power of community solidarity and collective action. Their intervention had helped ensure that Hayes faced consequences and that 2 good people received justice. A wedding day that started with joy and celebration was nearly destroyed by one racist officer's hatred, but ultimately became a catalyst for justice and reform. Hayes learned that in the age of smartphones and social media, racism comes with a price tag that some people simply cannot afford to pay. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.